first, let's just talk a little bit more about what is happening in the Middle East, because America and Israel's war with Iran continues. A little earlier, President Trump doubled down on his criticism of the UK, calling the Prime Minister no Winston Churchill. Well, Keir Starmer initially didn't permit the use of those British bases for the first wave of attacks against Iran, remember. He's now allowed their use, but for defensive purposes only. While the British government confirmed it's sending one of its most advanced warships to Cyprus, HMS Dragon will help increase security around RAF Akrotiri, which has been targeted by Iranian drones, as you mentioned earlier. Well, currently the Royal Navy has no major warship in the Mediterranean region. Meanwhile, Iran's Red Crescent says at least 787 people have been killed in the country since the US and Israel launched strikes on Saturday. In a moment, Jeremy Bowen will be giving us the very latest on the Middle East conflict. But first, here's our North America editor, Sarah Smith, on President Trump's outburst earlier.
Welcoming the German Chancellor to the White House, President Trump praised Germany's support for his war on Iran, while criticising countries he said were being unhelpful.
By the way, I'm not happy with the UK either. That island that you read about, the lease, okay, he made it for whatever reason, he made a lease of the island. Somebody came and took it away from him. And it's taken 3-4 days for us to work out where we can land there. It would have been much more convenient landing there as opposed to flying many extra hours. So we are very surprised. This is not Winston Churchill that we're dealing with.
The island Donald Trump is talking about is Diego Garcia in the Chagos Islands, where there's a joint US-UK airbase. The president's unhappy about British plans to hand sovereignty to Mauritius and lease back the island. The relationship between Donald Trump and Keir Starmer has never been more strained. The president says he is shocked by how uncooperative he believes the UK is being. The reasons President Trump gives for starting the war keep changing. Today he claimed Iran was about to strike against the US.
Based on the way the negotiation was going, I think they were going to attack first. And I didn't want that to happen. So if anything, I might have forced Israel's hand.
His Secretary of State offered a different explanation yesterday when he said the US knew Israel was planning to attack Iran and that Iran would retaliate by threatening US targets, so it was necessary to strike first.
We went proactively in a defensive way to prevent them from inflicting higher damage.
Lawmakers in Congress will be briefed later today by senior officials about the conflict and will have many questions about the administration's ever-evolving rationale for starting this war and about how it may end. Sarah Smith, BBC News, Washington.
Well, let's get some analysis from my colleague Sumi Somaskanda, who's at the White House, and Ben Wright, who is in Westminster. First, Sumi, to you, an ever-evolving kind of rationale is how Sarah Smith put it. And that's right, isn't it? Because it's still quite confusing for many exactly what the US's intentions are and why it started this in the first place.
It is, and President Trump's explanation today seemed to be the most recent twist, let's say, in that entire narrative that we've seen from the White House, from the president over the last few days. And he said, he was asked in particular, did Israel force your hand? This was referring to the fact that his Secretary of State said yesterday on Capitol Hill that the U.S. knew that Israel was going to attack Iran and that in response, Iran would hit U.S. targets. So in order to protect the U.S., American citizens, that the U.S. decided to attack preemptively. Well, President Trump said today, no, I actually forced Israel's hand in a way. And it was interesting to hear the president say that because he also said we had specific intelligence that Iran was going to attack us. That will be something, Mariam, I have to say that the president will be pressed on, that his administration will be pressed on, because until now, we've heard from a number of lawmakers who sit in the intelligence committees in both the House of Representatives and in the Senate as well, who have said they have not seen that intelligence. They're also going to be pressing him on not just the objectives of this conflict, but what the U.S.'s timeline is. In the past, President Trump has said 4 to 5 weeks, but at the same time, he has now said until those objectives are reached. And until the objectives are clear, it's hard to know just how long the U.S. will remain involved here.
And Sumi, how is this going down with those who support President Trump within the Republican Party and those who are really worried about what the future holds in terms of being embroiled in another foreign conflict?
It's a mixed picture so far. Of course, any of the polls that we're seeing at this point are still very recent and very small, so it's hard to get a real sense of how Americans, how voters might feel about this conflict. There was one poll that was released over the weekend by Reuters and Ipsos that indicated that just 1 in 4 Americans approve of the U.S.'s military action on Iran. But again, that is a very limited snapshot that we have. What we can say on a broader sense is this is a question that has in a way divided some of President Trump's Republican base. On the one hand, you have those who have stood firmly behind the president, who have said he has taken action that no other president was willing to take, and it was necessary to get rid of a rogue regime that posed a threat to Americans. On the other hand, there are many members of his base who have said, look, this is a president who promised not to engage the U.S. abroad, not to get involved in regime change, and this is exactly what he is doing here in Iran. At the same time, the president and his team say there is not going to be a prolonged involvement, not a multi-year conflict, as the Vice President J.D. Vance said on Fox News. This is going to ensure that Iran doesn't pose a threat, that its ballistic missile program is decimated, that it cannot build a nuclear weapon, and then the U.S. will leave. Still, many people wondering how long that will take and how much U.S. involvement will be there.
Sumi, thank you for that. And let's cross live now to our political correspondent, Ben Wright. And Ben, just talk to us a little bit about those comments that President Trump made about Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, comparing him or not comparing him to Winston Churchill. How's that going to have gone down?
I think they're proof of an increasingly fractured relationship between London and Washington. I thought it was interesting how President Trump delivered those remarks. I mean, they were planned, I thought. That wasn't really off the cuff. He wanted to say that and make an unfavourable comparison with Winston Churchill. Will they have been surprising to people in Downing Street? Perhaps not. They've got used to the way Donald Trump conducts public diplomacy over the years, and they may not be shocked, but it still is a pretty brutal sort of drive-by the US president. And as I said, is further proof of the strains in the relationship, strains that predate this current crisis. You know, there has been tension around Greenland, over trade, over trying to keep the US involved in Ukraine. There was quite a public falling out between the two in January after President Trump made disparaging remarks about British efforts in Afghanistan all those years ago that received a very public rebuke from Sir Keir Starmer. But for a British Prime Minister who has tried so hard to keep the American president close, Keir Starmer's decision not to involve the UK in offensive action against Iran and deny the US permission to use Diego Garcia as a launch pad for US bombers to attack Iran has clearly angered President Trump, and that comes on top of his, irritation, annoyance, fury about the Chagos Islands deal. So the two things are sort of linked, even though in practical terms they're not regarding this conflict in Iran.
OK, Ben, thank you very much indeed for that. Ben Wright in Westminster.